We're going to start tonight in Luke chapter 13, beginning with verse 10. Luke 13:10. If somebody would close that door to the hallway. Oh, Sarah's getting it. So, Jesus is either in Judea or he's in Perea. Now, let me give that to you again. I've pointed this out for the last few weeks. We're in this section where Jesus is down south. Remember, Galilee, where most of his ministry has been, is up north. Just south of Galilee is the region known as Samaria. South of that is the region Judea. If you head east from Jerusalem, which is in Judea, you'll come to the River Jordan at Jericho. And crossing the River Jordan, you're in what the land that in the Old Testament was known as Ammon and Moab. In Jesus' times, the Romans called that region Perea. Now, Jesus had come from Galilee down to Jerusalem back in late September of this year, the year we're discussing, and had come down for the Feast of Tabernacles. He has remained down south, teaching around Jerusalem, then around all of Judea. You know, he sent out the 70 while he was down there to all the villages and towns of Judea. He really wants to hit that main Jewish center with his ministries, teaching ministry. And he has gone across Jordan from Jericho over into Perea at least once. Come back into Judea, and he's about to go to Perea again. And he will stay down in these southern regions until early January, right after Hanukkah. And while he's down there, probably in January, right after Hanukkah, he raises Lazarus from the dead, which is at Bethany, just 2 miles from Jerusalem. Then he will go back up to Galilee and stay there until late March, ministering, and then make his final trip back to Jerusalem, where he'll be crucified in early April. So here's where we're at. He was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath day. And behold, next verse, we're just going to read it. And behold, there was a woman which had a spirit of infirmity 18 years, and was bowed together, and could in no wise lift herself up. I don't know if you've ever seen anyone afflicted with rheumatoid arthritis all over the joints of their body. It just bends you up. You can't move your fingers, your toes, your hands are clawed, just bent up, constantly in pain. Shoulders and spine, and this woman was like that. Next verse. And when Jesus saw her, now this is in a synagogue, he called her to him and said to her, "Woman, thou art loosed from thine infirmity." It just says it. You're loosed. Next verse. And he lays his hands on her, and immediately she's made straight. I'd just like to have been close and hear the popping of those joints and everything straightening out. And I imagine, you know, and she's made straight and begins to glorify God. Well, this is a happy moment, isn't it? But not for everybody. The ruler of the synagogue, the rabbi in charge of that particular synagogue, answered with indignation because that Jesus had healed on the Sabbath day. And this guy gets up and He would rebuke Jesus, but he doesn't dare rebuke Jesus. So he rebukes whom? He rebukes the woman for being healed. Of all the idiocies, he rebukes this lady who came in all bent up. Now she's straightened out, and rebukes her for getting healed. He says, there are 6 days in which men ought to work. In one of those 6 days, therefore, come and be healed. But not on the Sabbath. Don't come to be healed on the Sabbath day. And he thinks he's saying something important. You've violated the sanctity of the Sabbath by having Jesus lay hands on you, and not supposed to work on the Sabbath, and that's a work. Jesus, though, jumps in and interrupts the guy. He says, you hypocrite, thou hypocrite. I love this. Jesus is getting harsher and harsher, over these Sabbath controversies. And he just stops the guy in mid-sentence. Thou hypocrite, does not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or his ass from the stall and lead him away to watering? You've got a valuable animal that needs to be fed or watered. You're going to do that for that animal. How much more this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan is bound, these 18 years, how much more should she be loosed from bondage on the Sabbath day? Now, here's Jesus confronting a leader, a religious leader. How do the people react to this? Next verse. And when he had said these things, all his adversaries were ashamed, and all the people rejoiced for all the glorious things that were done by him. So the people at large see in this argumentation a real difference between the kind of things, rule-based, nitpicking rules they're taught by such a person as this leader of a synagogue, and the freeness that Jesus preaches. The kingdom of God has arrived, and it's not a whole bunch of silly-nilly rules. It's freedom. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. And Jesus gives verses 18 through 21. I'm not going to read them, but he gives 2 brief parables about the kingdom of God on this occasion. And one of them is the parable of the mustard seed. Cast it in your garden. Sooner or later, it's going to grow up into a tree and provide nesting place and refuge for the fowls of the air and the beasts of the field. Small little thing, but it's got life and power in it. It'll grow to be the largest of all herbal trees. And so the kingdom of heaven is welcoming. And he'll also talk about the kingdom of heaven being like a little bit of leaven, just that little bit of bacterial yeast that is put in a big lump of bread and kneaded into it, and eventually it will spread to the whole lump of dough and swell it. So the kingdom of heaven in both of those parables is a small thing that begins to give great and good influence. All right, now we're going to slip over to John chapter 10. This would be in the chronology what happens next. John chapter 10, beginning with verse 22. And it was at Jerusalem, the feast of the dedication, and it was winter. Now this is Hanukkah. It's a 14-day feast. It is the 9th feast that the Jews celebrate around the year. In the Old Testament, there were 7 special feast days: Passover and Tabernacles and Trumpets and the Feast of the Latter Rains. All these feasts, there were 7 of them that Moses had instituted. Then in the book of Esther, an 8th feast is added. You all know the story of Esther, don't you? When Queen Esther and her cousin Mordecai worked to deliver all the Jews in the Persian Empire from being exterminated under the the policies of wicked Haman. They celebrate that day, the 13th day of the month Adar, which is in February. They celebrate it as the Feast of Purim. And it's a 2-day feast, the Feast of Purim. The 13th, they call it Esther's Day, and the 14th of that month, they call it Mordecai's Day. And a lot of Jews go on for the entire week, but those are the 2 great days of the Feast of Purim. So now, there are 8 feast days. The Old Testament ends. We have about a 300-year period between the Old and New Testaments, right? That we, a lot of times, if we don't read books other than the Bible, we wonder what happened between the close of Malachi and the beginning of Matthew. There's really about 350 years gap between them. What's going on? Well, one of the things that goes on at that time is the Greek Empire. Alexander the Great has come through and has conquered Judea, Syria, former Palestine, and Egypt. And that's why by the time the New Testament begins, everybody's speaking Greek. That's why the New Testament ends up being written in Greek, because of Alexander the Great and his minions conquering the place. They made Greek the lingua franca of the region. Everybody is speaking Greek by Jesus' times, every educated person. Is this interesting to you? But something happens. After Alexander died, his empire, all the land he had conquered, which stretches from India back to Greece, huge conquest that Alexander accomplished. When Alexander dies, he's way over here in Babylon. And his conquered empire is split up by his 4 generals. Let's see, Lysander, Lysichus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. Those are the 4 generals. They divide up Alexander's conquest, and they each form a dynasty. Ptolemy, General Ptolemy, Greek-speaking Queen Cleopatra. I'm sure you know about her. And, Lysichus gets Macedonia, and Lysander gets Babylon, I think. But this general named Seleucus gets what Alexander called all of Syria, which includes Syria, Lebanon, the Transjordan, and what used to be Israel. And Seleucus and his descendants, the Seleucid dynasty, rule over Palestine and Syria for many generations during those 300 years. Roughly 170 years before the birth of Christ, one of Seleucus's descendants, a man infamous to the Jews, his name is Antiochus Epiphanes. That's what he called himself, the Epiphanes, the coming presence of glory, the Epiphanes among you. Antiochus goes into the temple in Jerusalem on the day that historians figure was none other than December 25th by our calendar. And he desecrates the temple, turns the holy place into a public latrine for his officers. He sacrifices a sow, a female hog, on that day on the great brass altar of Solomon at the entering in. And a war breaks out. A group of Jewish brothers known as the Maccabees. They raise up guerrilla troops all over to begin to attack the Greek soldiers. And it's known as the Maccabean Revolt. And they defeat the Greeks and run the Greeks out of Palestine. And the Maccabees take over. These are Jewish kinfolk, all named after their leader, Judas Maccabeus. And they have to cleanse the temple. It's been defiled for 3 years. Daniel had prophesied about this. A few hundred years earlier, over in Babylon, Daniel had seen, as a boy, he had seen the temple defiled by the Babylonians, right? Daniel was captured and taken to Babylon when the Babylonians had come to defile and then destroy Jerusalem. Daniel writes about something that he calls the Abomination of Desolation. Am I ringing any bells? I'm not getting any nods from anybody. I'm getting some of these stares like I would probably get if I were a Martian stepping out of a spaceship, talking in a foreign language of beeps and whistles to you. Let me know you're getting what I'm saying. Daniel had seen it happen. And Daniel prophesied in 70 years we'll be out of Babylon. We'll get to go back and rededicate the temple. Great. They do that 70 years after Daniel. But Daniel, who had already seen the desecration of the temple once, the abomination of desolation that he says, and the holy sacrifices will cease. The morning and evening sacrifices will cease until the temple is cleansed again. But while Daniel is in Babylon, even before the temple is rebuilt over there in Jerusalem and cleansed, he writes a strange prophecy about the future. He sees this evil Greek king. Daniel writes about it in a couple of his chapters and shows him as a bragging horn on a goat's head. And Daniel says he will again violate the holy place of the temple. He is coming, he will again, a Grecian he calls him. And he will bring again the abomination of desolation upon the holy place and defile the holiest of holies in the temple. And it will have to be cleansed again. Well, a few hundred years after Daniel is gone, and they've got the temple that had been rebuilt by Ezra and Nehemiah, here comes Antiochus and defiles the temple. The 3-year war to defeat the Greeks follows under the Maccabeans. They defeat the Greeks, and on the very day that the temple had been defiled, 3 years later to the day, they pronounce the rededication of the temple. I don't know why, I just felt the touch of the anointing saying that. It's been defiled twice. It's being rededicated now for the second time. And they've got some miracles connected with it. If you've ever read the Apocrypha, that's the 4 books of Maccabees, the book of Tobit, the book of Esdras, the book of Wisdom, the book of, I can't think of all of them right now. Maybe you've never read it. It's part of the Bible for about half of the world's Christians. For Protestants, those books were taken out of the Bible because they found some complaints about them. I was raised in the Catholic Church where we had those books in our Bibles. But anyway, the story of the Maccabees is that cleansed. And the miracle that they have is that they don't have enough oil to fill the menorah and keep it burning more than 1 hour. And they pour in the oil they have and fill up the 7-branch candlestick of the menorah on the day they dedicate it. And they say it's only going to burn for an hour because we don't have enough oil. And yet it burned for 14 days without going out. And so that is the feast of what they pronounce Hanukkah. Maybe you know Jewish friends. While we're celebrating Christmas, they celebrate Hanukkah. And it kind of overlaps with our Christmas season. Jesus is celebrating Hanukkah. Now, the word Hanukkah means the cleansing or the rededication. So the temple's been cleansed and rededicated, and they call it the Feast of Lights because of the oil that wouldn't run out of the menorah and burn for 14 days. Well, I don't know why. I feel a touch of God's Spirit while I'm relating these things. You can look it up and see how many details I'm getting wrong. But here is Jesus now, celebrating this, and it's winter. And Jesus goes into the temple and goes through Solomon's porch, part of the out part of the temple that is reminiscent of the great outer porch that Solomon had built, rebuilt by Ezra and them. Next verse. And so it's cold in Jerusalem. It's wintertime. And Jesus has got his blanket wrapped around him, as everybody does. They're staying warm. But still waiting for the next verse, verse 24. And then came Jews round about him, and they said to him, "How long do you make us to doubt? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly." Now, they're asking him, do you claim to be the Messiah? And they want him to answer that question. He had been asked that before, way out on the Jordan. He had been asked that question before, way up in Galilee. Do you claim to be the Christ? But now they're asking him right in the temple. Man, if he who doesn't watch his words, they can get him for desecrating this holy temple. I just popped a button on my jacket while I'm talking to you. Jesus answered him and said, "I told you, and you believed me not. The works that I do in my Father's name, they bear witness of me." And if you come down to verse 32, he talks on about, he doesn't come right out and say, "Yes, I am the Messiah." It's not time for him to get stoned yet. But if you come on down to verse 31, I believe. No, previous verse, verse 30. Jesus will say this, "I'll tell you this much, I and my Father are one." Now that is not only a mind-boggling statement, but to say it where he said it and when he said it is amazing. And so because he says this, and now get this, a few months later, Jesus is going to be crucified, condemned in that same city and crucified. How many of you know what they will crucify him for? Blasphemy? What else? What charges will they bring against Jesus when he's going to be crucified? Anyone. Claiming to be the Son of God, but that's not the first charge. That'll be the last one. They will want to charge him with working on the Sabbath day. That won't hold water. Then they'll charge him before the high priest the night he's arrested for saying, "You will destroy this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days." Because he said that, they think they've got something that they can crucify him with, and they're about or stone him to death with. They're about to do it the night he's arrested. But the high priest says, "We need at least 2, hopefully 3 witnesses. And I've got them lined up." So he said he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Does the second witness say so? And the second guy stands up and says, "Well, he said something like that, but not exactly. He didn't say he would destroy the temple and rebuild it. He said, if you destroy the temple, he'll rebuild it in 3 days." And the high priest says, "Don't we have 2 witnesses that'll corroborate this? How about the third one?" And the third one says, "Well, I heard him say that, but after he said it, I was standing close. He told some of the others he wasn't talking about this temple here. He was talking about the temple of his body, whatever that means." And the high priest tore his clothes and said, "Can't we get any witnesses that will agree together?" And then a fellow raises his hand and said, "I heard him say that he and God were one, and that God was his Father and he was the Son of God." And the high priest turns to Jesus and said, "Did you say that?" And Jesus says, "Right you are." Or in King James, "Thou hast said it." And the high priest now says, "We don't need any further witnesses. He has admitted it from his own mouth." Now, this statement that we're just reading Jesus saying at Hanukkah, in the temple, "I and my Father are one," this will be the thing that gets him crucified. And they get so angry, next verse said, when he said that, then the Jews took up stones again to stone him. And Jesus answers and says to them, "What have I done? You're going to stone me for all I work, but for blasphemy, because that you, being a man, maketh yourself God." And Jesus answers them, and he says a number of things concerning blasphemy and all of this. I won't even go into it because I want to move on with the story. But in verse 39, they sought again to take him, and he went forth out of their hand. This is like the fourth time we see a crowd of enemies wanting to take Jesus, and he just stands back and stares them down and passes right through the midst of them, none of them able or willing to reach out on his own and grab Jesus. Verse 40 says, "And Jesus went away again beyond Jordan to the place where John had first baptized, and he abode there." Now that's passing through from Jerusalem all the way a long trip down to Jericho, passing through Jericho, coming a mile or two to the edge of Jordan, and crossing at that place known as Beth Abara. Now that is where John was at first baptizing. How do we know that? If you go back in the Gospel of John, you'll find that when John the Baptist begins his baptizing, he baptizes at a place called Beth Abara, which means the place of the crossing. It's where Joshua had come across miraculously the River Jordan. Jesus goes across there, and he will be there for a couple of weeks, it seems like. And he abides there. He remains for a while. And many came unto him, and they said, John, next verse, brother, verse 41. Many resorted to him, and they said, John the Baptist did no miracles when he was here. But all the things that John spoke of this man were true. And many believed on him there. So he's over here in Perea. Hanukkah time has just passed. He's going to head back up to Galilee soon, but not yet. He's waiting for one thing to happen. Luke chapter 13, verse 22 will coincide with this. Luke 13, 22. Is this interesting to you? What does he do while he's over there in Perea? He goes through the cities and villages teaching, and then working his way back toward Jerusalem. Next verse. And one said unto him, Lord, are there few that be saved? Let's just read a little bit of this. And he said unto them, next verse, strive to enter in at the strait gate, for many, I say unto you, will seek to enter in and shall not be able. Now, Jesus has said this in Matthew. Luke comes along and says, I read what Matthew wrote. I'm putting it in order. So now from Luke, we know when this was said. About the wide road and the narrow road. And you've got to try to get in the narrow gate. Follow the narrow path. It's not a path of rules and regulations that eliminates everyone. It's just a road that not many will walk. That's why it's narrow. because not many will walk it. You can't get a crowd of people on it. They don't want it. They'd rather be on the big highway that everybody's walking on. People are crowd followers. But to walk with Jesus, you have to make an individual decision. Let me talk about this for a minute. Jesus did not call us to be part of the great crowd that calls itself Christian. Jesus called me and called you, each as an individual, to be a follower of the man who is called Christ. Now, there may be many that get on this road, but they're each on it as an individual. Jesus says to this young man who says, hey, are there just a few that are going to be saved? Well, Jesus doesn't really answer that question. No, there'll only be a few. There'll only be a handful. No. He just looks at him as an individual and says, you make your mind up where you're going to walk. And all this business about walking the pathway, that harks back to so many proverbs that Solomon spoke about the pathway of the wise man, the pathway of the righteous man, as opposed to the roadway of the fool and the wicked man. Hallelujah, Brother Pat. So he goes on. He has a lot to say, and he will predict the destruction of Jerusalem. Let's come down to verse 31. The same day there came certain of the Pharisees, saying unto him, Get thee out and depart from hence, for Herod will kill you. In other words, Jesus, you better get back up to Galilee where you got a lot of friends to protect you, because we got word out now that King Herod wants to have you put to death. And Jesus will heed this, but not immediately. He tells them, he's not going to bother me yet. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing for 3 more days. Everybody say 3 days. Let's listen to what he says. Go ye and tell that fox, King Herod. Any of you know who King Herod was? He was not even a Jew. He was not an Israelite. He was an Edomite, a descendant of Esau from the land of Edom, way down in Arabia. Herod became king because he married a woman named Mariamne, who had descended from the Maccabees I told you about earlier. Herod also did some favors for Caesar in Rome, and so Caesar appointed Herod king of Judea. Now that was Herod the Great, the Herod that was on the throne when Jesus was born. He died shortly after Jesus was born, and the next Herod, Herod Antipas, came along. And in the New Testament, we read of several guys in the Herod dynasty. Herod Antipas, Herod Philip. Now, who's the Herod that Paul talked to? And he said, Paul, you've almost persuaded me to be a Christian. Huh? No, Felix was... all the Herods were tetrarchs. That means ruler over a fourth part of Alexander's reign. Agrippa was this guy's name, Herod Agrippa. Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I knew that voice came from somewhere. And yeah, so Jesus says, you go tell that old fox, King Herod, behold, I cast out devils, I do cures. Today and tomorrow and the third day, I shall be perfected, pardon me. He's got 3 more days. They've told him, you better clear out of here. Jesus said, I got 3 days. And what he means here is, my work here will be perfected. Nevertheless, I must walk today and tomorrow and the day following. For it cannot be that a prophet perish outside of Jerusalem. Now, I'm not going to perish here in Perea. They're not going to kill me over here. if I get back to Jerusalem, that's when it's going to happen. So I'm going to stay here for 3 more days. All right. I think that's kind of interesting. He talks on a bit, and then we come to chapter 14 of Luke, beginning with verse 1. Now remember, this is cold time. Somebody said, well, it doesn't get cold in Israel. You better believe it. Jerusalem is right about on the same latitude as Atlanta, Georgia. It doesn't get too cold in Atlanta, but I sure have been in some blizzards there. And they have some blizzards in Jerusalem sometimes. From the high mountains in Lebanon, sometimes those snow clouds will come down and cover Jerusalem. Even if it's not snowing, it gets very cold there in December, January, and February. Verse 1, it came to pass, he's still over there in Perea, he comes into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees on the Sabbath to eat bread. And they were watching him. And behold, there was a certain man before him which had dropsy. What is dropsy? What is that sickness? Huh? It's a heart ailment where your heartbeat slows way down. And it's what they used to call dropsy. It's a feature in which your nervous system isn't making your heart beat as it should. And this guy had this. Jesus answering spake unto the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, let me ask you guys a question. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath day? Now this had come up a few weeks earlier in Jerusalem, remember? Healing on the Sabbath day. And they had accused him. He had straightened that woman out that had the rheumatoid condition. And they had jumped on him in that synagogue, or jumped on her for being healed by Jesus on the Sabbath day. So now Jesus turns it around. Let me ask the question of you guys. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath day? And they held their peace. Next verse. Verse 4, Brother Chris. They held their peace. They wouldn't answer Jesus' question. They're getting to the point where when he asked them questions, they look at one another. You go for it. No, you. They're not going to get into it with him because last time this came up in that synagogue, the whole people were divided, remember? So he just takes the man and heals him and lets him go. Verse 5. And he said unto them, which of you would have an ass or an ox fallen into a well or a ditch or a pit, and will not straightway pull him out, even though it's on the Sabbath day? An animal stuck in mud or falling down a well and can't get out, that animal's going to be eaten alive by birds and crows and vultures. And you've got to have enough pity on the animal. If it is a well shaft, a goat or a donkey has fallen into, that's going to take a lot of men to get down there with ropes, climb down there and harness around the animal and help lift it up without strangling it or breaking it up. If it's out there stuck in a mud flat, still takes a lot of work. You're going to have to hitch up some other animals and carry ropes out there and stomp through that mud and get them around him. And a large animal like an ox, you've got to get him. You can't leave him overnight. It's too horrible to imagine what other predators will do to the poor thing. So, on a Sabbath day, you'll do that. Now, in his earlier argument, he said, you'll go out and feed and water your farm animals on the Sabbath day. How much more should this woman not be raised up and healed on the Sabbath? Now he makes it even stronger. You can go and water an animal by yourself. But if this animal is fallen into a well, not only you, but you'll get all your neighbors to help you. You put a lot of effort into pulling it out. Which one of you would not do that or join in helping get that done, even if it were on a Sabbath day? And again, they could not answer these things. And so he spoke a parable to those which were bidden, when he marked how they chose out the chief seats. And of course, what follows is, actually a series of parables about taking the chief seat or waiting to have it offered to you and all of this. And verse 15 of the same chapter. You can go home and read his parables yourself and ponder them. When one of them that heard sat at meat with him, or one of them that sat at meat with him heard these things, he looks over at Jesus and said, "Blessed is he that shall eat bread in the kingdom of God." But Jesus said to him, "A certain man made a great supper and bade many." Now this is Luke's version of the famous parable of the wedding feast, where he invites some chosen ones to come, and they all give excuses. You know, I'd like to come, but I just got married, and my wife and I are going to enjoy our honeymoon. And the messengers go to another chosen one and said, "I'd like to come, but I just got a team of oxen and I've got to train them. They all come. I've bought a piece of ground I've got to work on." So none of those that were bidden to come and eat bread in the kingdom of God really wanted to come. They all had something else in mind. And so the master tells his servants, "Go out to the highways and the hedges then. Find the poor, the sinners, the nobodies, and invite them to come to my wedding feast." Now, Luke is clearly drawing, using Jesus' parable and placing it here, clearly drawing a difference between those Jerusalem Jews who claim to be the chosen and invited ones and nobody else but us can get into the kingdom of heaven, and all the other people of the world. Jesus is saying God will invite all of them, but you who were invited, you'll be left out, not because you're chosen to be left out, but because you refuse to come. Go down to verse 25. "Now there went with him great multitudes." That's all I want to read about that. Great multitudes. The phrasing as Luke uses it. When Jesus was up in Galilee in his first and second year of ministry, large crowds. Down here in Perea, these are not Galilean Jews, but people who call themselves real Jews, coming from Jerusalem, great crowds. Jerusalem is emptying itself out. People saying to one another, "Let's go find where Jesus is and hear him." A man on a horse can make that trip in a day. People walking, it's going to take them 2 days. But they've been coming over to Perea to hear him. Now, Luke chapter 15, verse 1, I'm about to close. "Now all the publicans and sinners were drawing near unto him for to hear him." Publicans and sinners. How many of you know what a sinner is? It's someone who is overtly sinning. He knows it. Everybody else knows it. You know, he gets drunk. He consorts with shady women, and he gambles and all this kind of stuff. He's just an open sinner. What's a publican? Huh? Thank you. A Jew that's gone public. Maybe, now what that means is he mixes with the public. Doesn't necessarily mean that he drinks or smokes or chews or kisses girls that do. It doesn't necessarily mean that he is overtly committing sins, but he's taken a job, perhaps, working at a Gentile's home. Therefore, he makes himself unclean just by entering in the Gentile home. Yes, sir? He's a non-kosher guy, sometimes out of necessity. Whether you're a sinner or a publican, the Pharisees condemn you the same. You're just as condemned If you're a publican who's trying to do right but must by necessity make yourself ceremonially unclean for your work, does not matter. You're as filthy and dirty in the eyes of God as if you were an adulterer and a murderer. That's the Pharisaic idea. Jesus has these publicans and sinners coming, and the next verse, verse 2 says, "And the Pharisees and scribes murmured, saying, This man receives sinners and eats with them." So I love this. Here's Jesus between two groups. Over here, the unclean, the intentional sinners and the unintentional sinners. That this group wouldn't even walk down on the same side of the street with those people. Over here is a mixture of two kinds of people, scribes and Pharisees. Now, of course, we've been examining Pharisees more than any other group. The scribes are doctors of the law. They, if you're preaching, you turn to one of the scribes and say, "Give me that verse," and he'll quote it right off for you, you know. And they're also copyists, so they're writing down things that they're seeing happen to make their report to the high priest. And the scribes and Pharisees murmur against Jesus. And Jesus responds, this is the famous Luke chapter 15, by telling three little parables. And we call these the three lost things. The first story he tells is a shepherd who has 100 sheep and loses one of them. And he steps aside from the 99 sheep he still has and goes out looking for the one that was lost. So what Jesus is saying is, the individual is just as important to God as the group, the crowd. Now let me tell you another story. A woman had 10 golden coins inside her house and lost one of them. She knew it was there somewhere, so she ransacked the house, emptied it out, tore up all the carpets off the floor, moved all the furniture out, lit a lamp, and went through dusting and cleaning, and finally found it wedged in a crack in the floorboard. And then came out calling all her neighbors, "Come rejoice with me, for the coin I had lost is found again." So there's two lost and found things. In the first one, the shepherd loses 1%, has 100 sheep and loses one of them. In the second one, the woman loses 10%. She's got 10 coins and loses one of them. Notice how it intensifies the value of what is lost. And now he tells the third story, and he says, a certain man had 2 sons, and one of them took his inheritance and went away into a far land, became unclean with drunkenness, with gambling, and with harlotries, wasted all of his substance, and ended up in financial and social, and probably troubled health-wise. And he's living in a pig pen. And he comes to himself and says, "I will return and go to my father." Well, you all know that famous story of the prodigal son, right? I just want you to notice why Jesus groups those three together as I'm finishing. In the first one, the shepherd goes outward to find the missing lamb. In the second parable, the woman goes inward, inside the house, to find the missing coin. But in this third parable, nobody goes looking for the boy. The father sits at home, staring down the road, waiting for the boy to make his own decision to come back home. And of course, the boy does. Jesus tells this story. I think these three parables are kind of grouped together. At this occasion, his last set of teachings about the kingdom that he'll give before he goes back up to Galilee. He groups them together to kind of show, this is the message I teach. God's not looking to say, How many of you can I exclude? But God goes out of His way to say, how can I include all those who come to me? God bless you. Thank you for your attention tonight.